In some houses, the silence is older than the furniture and far heavier to lift. Langley Court was such a place where glances lingered longer than necessary, and truth wore gloves. A whisper once spoken there could echo for generations, or vanish with the turning of a key. Where in the world are you tuning in from? And what time is it where you are? Let me know in the comments. Let's begin the story. The note had arrived at precisely 10 past 10 that morning, delivered not by telegram or footman, but enclosed in a pale blue envelope of a style now rare, the handwriting a firm, stately hand unused to haste. Superintendent Battle, who had learned long ago that the most dangerous signals came not from cries of alarm, but from polite invitations, turned the letter over once, twice, and read again the closing line. We should very much value the insight of an old-fashioned policeman's mind. Yours faithfully, Marcia Vane. There was nothing urgent in the phrasing, no plea nor veiled summons. Yet there was a curiosity about it that made him pause, then fold the letter with deliberate care. Lady Marcia was a name he knew, widow of Sir Algernon Vane, the once notorious judge, whose verdicts were as final in tone as they were in law. Battle, officially on a rare and reluctant leave, had planned to see an old friend nearby. A detour to Langley Court, then, would not be too far afield, and after all, one did not decline a cup of tea with the matriarch of such a house, not when the invitation came weighted with deliberate gentility. Langley Court stood behind a rust-licked gate, its gravel path partially surrendered to moss, and its lawns mown, but without love. The house bore the kind of architectural dignity that didn't decay. It faded, quietly and without complaint. Battle noted the ivy clinging to the stone like a protective spell, the heavy windows set deep in mullioned frames, and a portico where dust had settled gently into the grooves of the stonework. It was a place that had outlived its importance and knew it, but chose to keep up appearances. The man who answered the door, not a butler, not quite, wore a collar that had seen better starch and eyes that rarely looked up. Inside, the air smelt faintly of furniture wax and something older, not decay precisely, but a heritage that had curdled slightly under the weight of its own silence. They gathered in the east drawing-room, where the sun fell softly across embroidered cushions and the edge of a threadbare Persian rug. The air held the delicate aroma of orange pekoe, served from silver pots tarnished just enough to suggest independence from staff. Lady Marcia presided with the stillness of someone long accustomed to being observed without ever being touched. Her hair was snow-white, drawn back into a knot without vanity, and her pale eyes watched the room not with affection, but assessment. Gerald Vane, her eldest, stood stiffly by the window, gazing not out of it but into himself, the way some men do when presence must stand in for charm. Claire, the daughter, disinherited years ago for a misalliance, occupied a chair with the calm hauteur of one who had nothing to lose and knew how to wield that knowledge. Two others joined, a woman in her 30s with the kind of prettiness that seemed a burden more than a gift, and a solicitor, whose presence suggested duty, not comfort. Introductions were made with just enough civility to maintain order, but no warmth to suggest kinship. Battle, who had been offered the farthest chair from the fireplace, understood at once that the Vane family was not so much a gathering as a geometry, careful, balanced, and entirely without affection. Mrs. Isabel Markham, the young companion, moved with the gentle quietness of someone used to being needed, but not welcomed. Her voice was low and carefully shaped. She poured tea with unfailing courtesy, always second-guessing who preferred milk and who did not. Gerald thanked her without looking at her. In fact, he looked at no one directly except Claire, whose presence irritated him in ways he did not articulate, and Battle, whom he seemed to view with a kind of mild condescension. Isabel's hands trembled only once, when she passed the lemon slices, and Battle noted the glance she cast toward Lady Marcia before quickly dropping her eyes. The room, for all its civility, held no warmth, and Gerald's regard for Mrs. Markham, if it could be called that, was not kind. Possessive, perhaps, or territorial, like a man who resents the thing he claims. The knock came discreetly, and the man who entered was not announced. He needed no introduction. Sanjay Vane, dark-suited, upright, and entirely unreadable, paused briefly just inside the room. He was younger than Gerald, older than Claire, and bore no family resemblance except in the way he stood, spine straight, expression reserved, belonging and not belonging at once. A nephew, yes, the late judge's sister had married in Calcutta decades earlier, but his foreign education and the mystery of his past had made him a creature apart. Lady Marcia offered him a nod that was neither affectionate nor cold. Gerald's expression did not change. Claire's lips curled very slightly, though not in greeting. The solicitor stiffened. Isabel Markham alone smiled, a smile of quiet relief, as though the room had been too perfectly arranged and needed breaking. Mr. Merton sat apart, legs crossed carefully, his papers folded and unopened on his lap. He was a thin man, thin in face, in frame, in presence, like someone whose natural instincts had been ironed out by the law. Battle had met many solicitors, but few who gave so little away while seeming so desperately anxious not to be noticed. Merton spoke rarely, and only when addressed, his eyes never resting too long on Lady Marcia. His tea cooled untouched beside him, though he appeared not to notice. Battle observed how Merton's fingers rubbed the edge of the napkin with unconscious repetition, and how, when the family spoke, he listened too intently, as though every word carried implications that only he could truly understand. It was not guilt, Battle thought. Not yet, but there was certainly something Merton feared, and it was not the law. The conversation skimmed across birthdays and weather, touching upon the war years with the well-rehearsed phrases of those who had suffered in comfort. No one mentioned the letter, not yet, nor the terms of the will, though everyone in the room seemed to circle it. Battle watched the tray as it moved from hand to hand, the subtle rituals of sugar and lemon, the way Claire stirred hers longer than necessary, the way Gerald drank too quickly. Lady Marcia held her cup with care, sipped twice, then set it down untasted. Isabel Markham drank with the devotion of someone wishing to disappear into the task. Sanjay did not take tea. The air shifted as the hour passed, not in sound but in the small changes one only noticed when one had been trained to sit quietly in rooms with people who had things to hide. The unspoken thing, whatever it was, lingered between them like the faint scent of burnt toast, barely noticeable, but acrid beneath the civility. Battle, who had learned that tension made itself known not in what people said, but in what they left unsaid, folded his hands in his lap, and waited. He did not speak. There was as yet no need. The house would speak for itself, in time. The portrait hung above the fireplace in the smaller of the two libraries, its frame austere and overlarge for the canvas, as though the house itself sought to enshrine the man within it more than any artist could. Judge Vane, rendered in firm, realist strokes, sat not so much in repose as in judgment. His eyes, sharp, grey, slightly narrowed, followed a man across the room, not with warmth but with scrutiny. The mouth, drawn thin and tight-lipped, hinted at a lifetime of unforgiving decisions. He had worn the robes of the judiciary, not as a duty, but as a second skin. Battle stood before the painting with a slight tilt of the head, arms folded behind his back, feet placed with quiet purpose on the worn carpet. It was not the workmanship of the portrait he studied, It was the way the silence in the room changed around it. There was reverence, yes, but the wrong kind. Not the affection of memory, but the unease of a legacy best not touched. Battle had observed it earlier in Gerald's glance, the habitual nod toward the portrait as he passed, almost reflexive, like a schoolboy who still feared correction. Claire had ignored it entirely, not defiantly, but with studied indifference, as if the very act of omission signified rebellion. The portrait loomed, not only because of its position, but because the household had never quite outlived the man it contained. It had outlived his breath, perhaps, but not his consequence. The voices in the hall began as low as the wind threading through the leaded panes, but Battle, trained to decipher tone long before content, caught the thin edge of Claire's laugh first. It was not laughter precisely, more the brittle snap of amusement that carried sharpness beneath. The exchange was brief but telling. Gerald, too loud by half a note, had spoken of duty, the family's, hers, the importance of appearances. Claire's reply came cool and exact. Some appearances deserved to be ruined. The silence that followed was more informative than any quarrel. Gerald's retreating footsteps were measured, but heavy. Claire did not follow. Battle stepped aside as they passed the open doorway, catching the edge of her profile. Elegant, immovable, as she lit a cigarette with fingers too still to be casual. Gerald's back was straight, his shoes, leaving clean impressions on the wool runner. The corridor held its breath. The quarrel, if it could be called that, had been bloodless, no raised voices, no expletives, but it left a bruise in the air that did not fade quickly. In households like this, truth rarely shouted, it was muttered, sharpened, then tucked away like a knife in a drawer. The day had begun in sunlight, a strained warmth that gave little comfort, but by late afternoon the change was undeniable. Clouds rolled from the north, not fast, not dramatic, but slow and heavy, as though summoned. Battle stood by the east window, the teacup cooling in his hand, and noted the rustle of the box hedge, the sudden hush of the birds. Weather, like conversation, altered slowly in places like Langley Court. The shift was felt first in pauses. In a room of mirrors, the curtains moved without breeze. The storm announced itself not with thunder but with anticipation. Somewhere deep in the house, a door clicked shut with more finality than force. Evening meal was called a shade earlier than usual, though no one remarked on it. The table, lit with soft lamps and silver candlesticks, shimmered with careful excess. The silence had texture, knives against porcelain, the faint echo of a chair adjusted, the short-lived clink of a dropped spoon. Mrs. Markham, seated to Lady Marcia's left, looked pale but composed, her hands folded loosely, her posture immaculate. She had barely touched her soup. Battle, several places down, noted the slight sheen of perspiration at her temple, the way she blinked too deliberately, as if willing her surroundings to steady. It happened with no forewarning, no gasp, no drama. One moment she was seated, and the next her hand drifted from the table's edge, and her body sagged gently to the right. The footman reached her foot, then Gerald, who stiffened rather than acted. Lady Marcia remained seated. Her expression was not alarmed, merely observant, and for a moment Battle wondered whether she had expected it. A murmured call for water, a cushion brought, and within minutes the woman was conscious again, murmuring apologies, brushing at invisible crumbs. "It's nothing," she whispered, and Battle noted that no one contradicted her. Afterwards, the drawing-room filled once more, though the conversation now carried a different timbre, more hushed, more fractured. Battle remained to the edge, allowing others to forget he was there, as they often did. It was then that his gaze shifted to the far alcove, where two figures stood in partial shadow, Mr. Merton and Sanjay Vane. Their conversation was low and spare, but Battle needed no words to read its undercurrent. Merton's shoulders were drawn in, a posture of contained strain, and his head inclined with the deference of a man trying not to offend. Sanjay, in contrast, stood composed, arms behind his back, his expression unreadable. It was not confrontation, but something quieter, the careful fencing of two men who both knew more than they had said. Battle observed the flicker in Merton's throat as he swallowed mid-sentence, and the way Sanjay's head turned just slightly toward him, not in acknowledgement, but in emphasis. There was something being tested, some boundary assessed. Merton's hand moved, a slight gesture, uncertain, and Sanjay, after a pause, gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Then they parted. Merton returned to the center of the room with a folded napkin in his hand, and a hollow calm in his eyes. Sanjay did not rejoin the gathering. He stood by the window, looking out at the storm as it finally broke, not violently, but in a steady, persistent rain that washed everything without cleansing it. Battle, still silent, let the moment settle. He had seen the chessboard shift, not with a move, but with a look. The silence that descended upon Langley Court that morning was unlike the calm of sleep or the hush of ceremony. It had the strange, insulated quiet of something already concluded. The fire in the drawing-room had burned low, leaving only the occasional sigh of embers in the grate. Outside, the wind moved gently across the lawns, combing through the ivy, as if nothing beneath it had changed. It was the housemaid who first entered, not out of habit, but summoned by a sense of time passing too smoothly. She did not scream, she was not the type, but she stood long enough in the doorway for someone else to notice her stillness. Lady Marcia lay on the rug before the hearth, her head turned slightly, as if she had meant to rise, but hadn't. One slipper had slipped from her foot. Her teacup lay on its side, the saucer cracked, the dark stain of liquid seeping into the pattern of the carpet with quiet insistence. Her face was composed, the expression unchanged from that same aloof vigilance she had worn in life. If anything, she looked like she had chosen the moment, chosen to, not to resist it. Superintendent Battle, who had risen early and taken to the terrace for a solitary walk, was called in with restrained haste. By the time he entered the drawing-room, the room had filled with the sort of silence particular to death in a grand house. Orderly, embarrassed, half suspecting it might be inconveniencing someone. Gerald stood by the mantel, not touching it. Claire, leaning against the doorframe, appeared almost unsurprised. Mrs. Markham sat quietly on the edge of the sofa, hands clenched in her lap. Battle said very little. He knelt beside the body, looked first at the positioning, then at the tea. Nothing violent, nothing disorderly. Yet the arrangement of it all seemed somehow too finished, as though the scene had written itself before anyone had found it. The initial reaction, as it often was in such households, leaned toward the comfortable belief of natural causes. Lady Marcia had been in her 75th year, a slip of the heart perhaps, a weakness in the blood. She had eaten little the night before, drunk less. A quiet exit was in keeping with the sort of life that preferred not to cause disturbance, and certainly the sort of death her family might prefer to believe. The physician, Dr. Pelham, was summoned from the village. A cautious man with round spectacles and a cautious tone, he knelt beside the body with professional solemnity, nodding often and saying little. But Battle had already noticed several things. The teacup, for one, a fine porcelain piece from a mismatched set. Not the usual service if he recalled correctly. And the fact that Lady Marcia had not finished her drink. Uncharacteristic, he thought. She had been precise in her habits, punctilious. The chair she had used bore no sign of a fall. The rug showed no scuff. Her shawl was still in place. The fire had not yet required replenishing. All these details, small and apparently irrelevant, sat neatly in his mind, like parts of a machine that did not yet function. He made no accusations, issued no orders. He merely stood beside the doctor, arms loosely crossed, his face giving away nothing but quiet thought. Then, in a tone even less expressive than usual, he asked that a formal post-mortem be carried out, not because there was immediate cause for suspicion, he never said so, but because something in the room did not quite ring true. Dr. Pelham looked at him with mild surprise, hesitated, and then nodded once, the decision left unspoken between them. The family murmured assent, too mannered to object outright. By late morning the doctor returned with a sterner expression than before. His footsteps echoed in the corridor like someone unused to bearing news. He asked to speak privately. Battle did not insist. The small room off the library served as a study and was seldom used. There, with the fire barely catching, Pelham cleared his throat twice before speaking. There was digitalis in the bloodstream, he said. A significant quantity. Battle inclined his head. Recent enough, said the doctor. A deliberate dose, not the sort one takes in error. Someone knew what they were doing. The words hung in the room, not loud, but final in the way truth often was. Battle allowed a pause. He did not show surprise, nor did he respond with haste. Only after a moment did he speak again. "She drank tea," he said. Pelham nodded. "Yes." Battle stood, thanked him with a brief word, and returned to the drawing room. The scene remained unchanged. The mark on the rug, the faint scent of ash. But now the room felt different. Not because a death had occurred, but because something had entered it in death's wake, a question with weight, and the knowledge that someone among them had guided the hand that lifted that cup. The request was made without force, phrased in that calm, matter-of-fact manner which Battle had long cultivated, a voice that gave no offense and yet left no alternative. In the presence of Dr. Pelham and a notably subdued Gerald Vane, he outlined his intention not to summon London, not yet, but rather to remain quietly at Langley Court to make a few inquiries. His tone was modest, administrative. It asked for nothing more than permission to stay, though in truth it implied something closer to necessity. Lady Marcia's death, he noted gently, had been unnatural. Digitalis, a word no one wished repeated, had left the matter unsettled. Gerald, who had begun to object, fell silent under the weight of the word. Dr. Pelham, visibly relieved to pass the responsibility into another's hands, murmured agreement. Claire said nothing, but her arched brow conveyed dry amusement, as if she had anticipated precisely this. The household, still anchored in a tradition that prized appearances above consequence, did not protest. There would be no uniforms, no reporters, nothing public. Battle would remain discreet. The phrase was used deliberately and without irony. For people like the Vanes, discretion was not courtesy, it was lifeblood. Battle understood that perfectly, and so it was settled. He would stay on, quietly, unhurriedly, his presence folded into the routines of the house, like an extra shadow on the stair. The investigation began not with accusation, but with ritual, the re-establishing of time, habit, and routine. Battle walked the corridors alone, noting the texture of the carpets, the slight groan of particular stair treads, the smell of polish and old paper. He returned to the drawing-room, and stood for some minutes before the empty hearth, then bent again over the faint tea stain on the rug, dry now but still distinct. The broken saucer had been removed. Someone had tidied the scene. He began, as always, with the domestic staff, not because they were most likely guilty, but because they most often remembered. The cook, A severe woman named Mrs. Roach answered his questions without enthusiasm. She had not prepared the tray herself, but it had been assembled under her supervision. No, there had been nothing unusual about the tea, the same loose-leaf blend used daily, though she did recall that Mrs. Markham had requested her own china be used for Lady Marcia that afternoon, owing to a chip in one of the regular cups. A detail perhaps, or perhaps not. The housemaid who had carried the tray was a girl named Ellen, pale and anxious in the way that comes of having too much responsibility at too young an age. She recalled little. Yes, she had delivered the tray. No, she had not remained in the room. No one had entered after her to her knowledge. Battle asked whether she had seen Mrs. Markham in the kitchen beforehand. She hesitated, then nodded. "Only briefly, sir. She looked." The girl paused. "Pale, I think." He made no comment. From the staff he turned, carefully, to the family. Each member was spoken to not in interrogation but in conversation. Battle listened as Gerald described his afternoon walk around the perimeter of the property, always the same route, by habit, not pleasure. Claire had been reading in the library. No one had disturbed her. Sanjay Vane had spent the time in his room, writing letters. None of them asked why he inquired. All of them assumed he had a reason. Battle took particular note, not of what they said, but of how they said it, who avoided eye contact, who answered too quickly, who seemed to forget what they had already told someone else. There was little contradiction, but even less comfort. The household moved like figures in a drawing-room play, repeating their lines too precisely. The tea had been prepared, served, and consumed, or nearly consumed, with ceremony. Yet within that ceremony, something had slipped. Battle's questions were not difficult, not confrontational, but they marked the first true disturbance in Langley Court since Lady Marcia's death, not because of what they revealed, but because of what they began to unsettle. The solicitor cleared his throat with the hesitation of a man who would rather read accounts of war than wills. Mr. Merton sat at the head of the small parlour table, the contents of Lady Marcia's final testament spread before him in a hand too careful to be impulsive. The family, such as they were, sat at a remove, not together, not entirely apart. Gerald lounged in the high-back chair as if the furniture owed him comfort. Claire leaned by the French window, chin slightly raised, a habitual angle for someone who had long ago abandoned expectation. Sanjay remained silent, his arms folded, a figure neither disapproving nor indifferent, but curiously unanchored. Mrs. Markham sat furthest from the rest, eyes cast downward, the modest folds of her dress arranged with unnatural care. Sir Will, as read, began with the expected decorum, bequests to staff, minor acknowledgements, a donation to a quiet parish, but then came the name Isabel Markham. A pause followed. The solicitor, blinking once, continued, "To Mrs. Markham was left the house in its entirety, the residual estate, and the shares in Vane Agricultural Holdings, Limited. The effect was not immediate uproar. Langley Court was not a house that permitted such things, but a more insidious shift, like the air becoming subtly thinner." Gerald spoke first, not loudly, but with a short laugh that failed to find its ending. Claire gave no response beyond the slightest tilt of her head, her expression unreadable, as though the turn of events had simply caught up to a private expectation. Sanjay did not move. It was Mrs. Markham who reacted with the most sincerity, though her voice was soft, almost inaudible, the words scarcely more than a whisper. "I didn't know." The silence that followed felt final, but Battle, standing near the doorway, understood that finalities in such houses were often only beginnings. The question of the missing heirloom arose not from sentiment, but from form. Lady Marcia's will had listed all significant possessions, including the Vane family watch, a heavy gold timepiece engraved with the family crest, passed down through 3 generations of judicious and uncompromising men. It had not been among her effects. Gerald had noticed its absence before the reading, but mentioned it only afterward, as though realizing belatedly that its value extended beyond monetary measure. Mrs. Markham, when asked, stated plainly she had last seen the watch on Lady Marcia's dressing table 2 nights prior. The maid could not recall moving it, neither could the butler, who had stopped short of saying he'd ever laid eyes on it at all. Claire, when asked, shrugged with elegant indifference. It was hers, she said. She wasn't in the habit of losing things. Gerald, less patient, referred darkly to sentimentality being misplaced. To Battle, the absence of the watch did not yet speak of theft. It spoke of motive, or more precisely, of proximity. Who had been close enough to take it, and why? Its disappearance did not confirm guilt, but it did suggest a breach of trust, of ritual, of the careful maintenance of roles in a household defined by them. The item's significance lay not in gold or lineage, but in the fact that it was missing at all. The map was not literal, though Battle had constructed it in his mind with the precision of habit. The drawing room where Lady Marcia had last been seen, the time approximated at just past 5. The tray had been cleared later, the fire banked. Mrs. Markham had assisted her to the chair, or so it was said. Claire had retired early to her rooms. Gerald had walked along the back gardens, unaccompanied. Sanjay had not been seen until the following morning. Each movement, each declaration placed a piece on the board. The difficulty lay not in assembling the map, but in discerning which move had been disguised as another. Battle did not rush. He spoke with each in turn, courteously, firmly, without suspicion in his tone, but with the weight of quiet intent. Claire's movements were recounted with a precision that made them feel rehearsed. Gerald's walk had been interrupted by a telephone call, a detail confirmed by the parlour-maid. Mrs. Markham's statement was longer, filled with fragments of care and concern, as though the act of serving tea had required more effort than it rightly should. Sanjay said little. He had been in his room, writing letters no one had seen, to recipients unnamed. Patterns emerged, not in statements but in hesitations. Claire had not left her room, yet described the drawing-room fire as still burning when she retired, a detail she could not have known. Gerald's walk, timed against the call, left an awkward gap. Mrs. Markham's narrative, though plausible, carried a faint aroma of polish, too neat, too humble. Battle asked nothing more than was necessary. He let them talk, and more importantly, let them stop talking. She did not cry. That would not have suited her. When Battle asked whether she had known about the will, Mrs. Markham's face shifted not in surprise, but in effort, the sort of composure one maintains, because to do otherwise would be unseemly. "No," she said. "I had no idea." Her hands remained still in her lap, but Battle saw the fine tremor in the right thumb, involuntary, unguarded. There was a gentleness in her voice, but not weakness. It was the voice of someone accustomed to discretion, to not asking questions, to receiving decisions as they came. And yet beneath the surface lay something harder to define, not deception, but fear of implication. She repeated her innocence, but not with insistence. "I didn't want anything from her," she said softly. "I was only ever—" She did not finish the sentence. Battle let the silence lengthen. In silence, truth often began to shift. He studied the way she folded her hands again, the careful way she blinked, as though her thoughts had edges too sharp to voice. Guilt, perhaps, or merely the burden of being named in a legacy that no one expected. He noted it, not with judgment, but with a quiet pencil mark in his mind. The question was not whether she knew. It was why, if she truly hadn't, the fact had so clearly startled her. The tea tray had been removed by Ellen, the housemaid, sometime after 6, or so she claimed. But when questioned again, the time became less certain. "It might have been closer to 7, sir. I remember because cook was cross that I'd not come back sooner." Mrs. Roach confirmed the irritation, but not the time. She recalled that Mrs. Markham had entered the kitchen briefly, but not whether she'd stayed. She was looking for something, the cook said. Didn't say what. Battle returned to the drawing room. The chipped cup had been replaced, the saucer cracked. The tray itself had held 4 cups, not 3. One of them, Ellen admitted, had been from Mrs. Markham's own set. The other had a crack. She said it wasn't suitable. That, too, might have been nothing, but in households like Langley, where ritual reigned supreme, such substitutions meant something. He questioned Mrs. Markham again, gently, without pressure. She recalled the tray, remembered asking for the other cup. It was just for symmetry, she said. Lady Marcia liked things to match. Battle said nothing. The matching was noted, but so too was the change, and the fact that the tea once poured had not been finished. He returned to the kitchen once more, and this time asked to see the tray. It had already been scrubbed. That too, he noted, not damning, but curious, scrubbed too early or too late. The facts accumulated, not with weight but with presence, quiet, watchful, unblinking. The stove in the scullery had long since gone cold, its iron belly now lined with a soft white ash that bore the ghost of what it had consumed. Battle crouched beside it, silent, as the maid hovered just outside the door, wringing her hands against the edge of her apron. He did not speak to her. The silence was more instructive. With the tip of a clean poker, he nudged the remains apart, revealing a shape where cloth had failed to fully yield to flame, the fingers of a glove, the stitching still faintly visible, though scorched. Leather, not cotton. Quality, it had not burned entirely, which meant it had been placed hastily, without proper kindling, and likely in the hours after the fire had lost its heart. He reached in with gloved hands and drew it out gently. The smell was faintly chemical, unpleasant, as though perfume had once lived on the leather and now recoiled from heat. There was no embroidery, no initial. A man's glove, Battle thought, though perhaps not a large one. He turned it slowly, noting a thin tear along the edge of the cuff, the sort of rip that happened in anger or haste. It had not been dropped here. It had been hidden, and then destroyed, or attempted. But like most hurried acts in places built on order, it had left its residue. The hearth remained open. He stood, brushing ash from his sleeve. The maid had not moved. He looked at her, nodded once, and stepped past without a word. The glove was evidence of nothing, yet it belonged to someone, and someone had hoped it would not be found. It was in the library hours later that the second remnant emerged, not from the stove this time, but from the fireplace, not fully burned but torn, as if someone had hesitated at the last. The fragments lay behind the andiron, caught in the small drift of soot that no one had swept. Battle, kneeling again, drew them out one by one, laying them gently upon the writing table. The paper was coarse, foreign, a texture more common to tropical climates than English drawing rooms. The handwriting, when decipherable, bore a looping rhythm, unhurried, with flourishes uncommon to an English hand. He worked with slow precision, piecing the torn halves along their natural fractures. Some lines were gone entirely, consumed by flame, but the rest, water-stained, ink-smudged, formed a narrative more powerful than anything whole. The letter was addressed to Marcia Vane, dated from Calcutta some months prior. The signature was faint but still legible, Ashok Dutt. That name did not belong to the present. It belonged to something buried beneath time and reputation. From the fragments, a shape of truth began to emerge. A man once employed in judicial service, dismissed without trial, disgraced without hearing. The implication was clear. Judge Vane had orchestrated a ruin, deliberate, methodical, the kind of destruction that did not bruise but erased. And Lady Marcia, in possession of that knowledge, had kept the letter, or perhaps hidden it, until someone else found it. Battle's expression did not shift, but the silence around him grew denser. Here was motive, not for murder perhaps, but for silence, for fear. The past, long thought immobile, had stirred. The question was in whose hands had it landed before the fire. The boy had not been a boy for many years, but the designation lingered. Sanjay Vane, tall, quiet, with that mixture of grace and guardedness, particular to men who carry inherited shame, had always stood apart from the others. Battle, seated across from him in the garden's outer bench, studied him not with suspicion, but with inquiry born of quiet curiosity. The letter had named Ashok Dutt. The family had called Sanjay Vane. The difference, Battle thought, was not small. Sanjay did not resist the conversation. He spoke slowly, as though translating from a deeper language into one suitable for English air. Yes, Ashok Dutt had been his father. Yes, he had been wronged. No, he did not blame Lady Marcia for it, nor had he asked her for anything. He had come, he said, because she had written to him. She had told him something. A truth, not of absolution, but of awareness. Battle nodded once, then let silence stretch. Sanjay did not fill it. He seemed a man to whom absence had been more familiar than speech. Battle reflected that revenge did not always manifest in action. Sometimes it lived in presence, the right to return, to stand without apology where one's father had been cast out. If the letter had passed to Sanjay, he had returned it, burnt it perhaps, or perhaps not. But what Battle saw in him was not malice. It was weight, old, ancestral, but worn with dignity, the sort of burden one did not shed, only chose not to pass on. There had been something altered in Lady Marcia in those final days. Several had remarked on it, a softness of tone, a distraction in her routines. Battle thought now of those qualities not as decay, but as intention. There were women, especially women of her generation, who mistook silence for justice and endurance for virtue. But something had turned. The letter might have been the trigger, or merely the final straw in a mind long burdened by complicity. Was she seeking redemption? The word itself felt misplaced, too ecclesiastical. But perhaps, Battle considered, she had sought correction. An old woman facing the precise boundaries of her own life, and choosing, finally, to adjust the weight of it. Not by confession, not by punishment, but by gesture. A legacy revised, a secret entrusted. Whether she had succeeded was another matter. Motives, once loosed, did not always travel the paths they were meant to. Claire was alone in the west parlour, her legs stretched idly across the chaise, a book open but unread. When Battle entered, she did not rise. He did not take a seat. Their conversation was brief, precise, shaped by tone rather than content. He asked what she had known of the letter. She answered without inflection. Enough, she said, but not everything. Her fingers turned the page of her book, though she had not read the previous. She had not burned it, she said, but she had read it. She had confronted her mother, not out of anger, at least not entirely, but because the silence had become intolerable. She was already dying, Claire said quietly. What could I possibly do to her? Her smile when it came was not bitter. It was cold and tired. There was no affection in her voice, nor hatred, only the dull edge of something long concluded. She had loved her father once, perhaps as a child loves a wall, because it is there and seems immovable, but walls crack, and daughters watch them fall. Merton stood by the fire with the rigid posture of a man who had learned the cost of comfort. Battle spoke to him gently, without question. The solicitor responded with clipped civility, the edge of deference never quite leaving his voice. His answers were sufficient, in law, but Battle observed more than words. He watched the tremor at the corner of the man's left eye, the sheen of sweat that had no place in a temperate room, the fingers that touched his temple not from headache, but from an old nervous habit. Merton was not involved, but he was afraid, not of discovery, of something else, some loyalty, perhaps, or debt, or consequence older than any document. His fear was not guilt, but it was close enough to shadow it, and Battle, who had long known the difference between silence that protects and silence that buries, marked it well. The drawing room, emptied of its usual occupants, had regained its neutrality, but Battle, standing at the center of the rug where Lady Marcia had sat that final afternoon, sensed that the room still held memory, not conscious or spiritual, but embedded in the routines of its objects. He turned to the tea table. The service had been cleared days ago, but the sideboard retained its impression, the faint watermark of a saucer, a ring slightly askew, as if the cup had been set down in hesitation. He bent slightly, eyes level with the surface, noting the curve and residue where polish had met resistance. Clean, but not pristine. He asked for the tea set to be brought from the scullery, not the full one, only the pieces used that day. What arrived was mismatched. 3 cups of the floral gilt-edged variety that belonged to Lady Marcia's daily service, and a 4th, finer, subtly different in weight and curve. He turned the base of each. The floral bore the stamp of a well-known London manufacturer, the 4th, Meissen, delicate, pale, and marked with a faint chip on the inner rim. He did not handle them as evidence, but as remnants of ritual. The 4th cup had not belonged here, and yet it had been offered, not by accident. He turned it once more in his hand, then reached for the saucer, noting a slight smudge on its lip. Not quite a fingerprint, but something. It was not his habit to speak to forensic men before time had allowed the facts to settle, but in this instance he made quiet exception. A fingerprint technician from Reading had been discreetly summoned the evening prior. The results, passed to him that morning, were thin. The household, in its entirety, had long since left their prints on every surface of the drawing-room. Familiarity was no crime, but on the saucer something remained, a faint set of prints not matching those of the kitchen staff, nor those of Claire, Gerald, or the maids. One match stood apart, delicate, partial, consistent with Mrs. Markham's right forefinger. That in itself was not incriminating. She had served the tea, but what raised Battle's inner caution was not her prince's presence, but the absence of others. The housekeeper, the parlour-maid, Lady Marcia herself, their prints appeared only faintly, incompletely, as if wiped. Only Mrs. Markham's remained distinct. Such details did not scream, but they suggested. People tidy things when they are embarrassed, or guilty, or when they believe an object matters more than it does. He read the technician's notes again, then set them aside without expression. Fingerprints were not verdicts, but in a household ruled by ritual, inconsistencies were where the truth began. Mrs. Roach, the cook, was not a nervous woman. She bore the stiffness of someone who regarded kitchens as sanctuaries against the unpredictable excesses of drawing-room life. But she met Battle's questions with the guarded clarity of someone who had already reviewed her part of the story in full. "The tea was the same as always," she said. "Boiled proper, poured into the pot, same as yesterday and the day before." Battle said nothing, only watched the minute movements behind her words, the way her hands folded at the waist, one thumb rubbing slowly over the other. She continued, "The cups were arranged by Ellen, except the one. Mrs. Markham asked for her own cup, said the other was chipped." He nodded once. "Did you see the chip?" Mrs. Roach hesitated. "No, sir, but I didn't look for it. I assumed she knew." "And Ellen?" "She didn't say nothing about a chip, sir, only followed what she was told." Battle allowed a pause, letting the weight of her own admission settle. The shift in routine had not been questioned, perhaps out of habit, perhaps out of hierarchy. Mrs. Markham was above reproach, at least in that domain. Yet the cook's voice, though firm, held an edge of retrospective doubt, as if, given the chance, she might now ask questions she hadn't dared to before. "Mrs. Markham brought the cup herself, then?" he asked. "Yes," she replied, "from her own sideboard, told Ellen to use it. Said Lady Marcia preferred symmetry." Symmetry, a word that served as both explanation and deflection. Battle inclined his head, offered a quiet thanks, and left her to the ritual of restoring order, a ritual, he suspected, more comforting than truthful. The china cupboard was narrow, immaculately arranged, and very clearly separated from the household's usual service. Mrs. Markham's set, thin porcelain with pale green edging, occupied the center shelf. It was not luxurious, but it was personal, chosen, and kept with care. The cup used for Lady Marcia now returned to its place, matched precisely, save for the faint chip at the rim. The explanation had already been given. The usual cup had been chipped, necessitating the substitution. Yet the regular service now examined showed no damaged piece. Battle held each cup to the light, tapped each rim gently with a knuckle. None bore cracks or flaws. He replaced them slowly, the space between each item deliberate, measured. He asked Ellen again, separately. Had she noticed the chip? "No, sir," she said, after a pause too long for comfort. "I only did what Mrs. Markham asked." The lie, if it was one, was small, but it mattered. In this house, where status was measured in small privileges, and the social ladder ran vertically through the kitchen door, a companion's request was not lightly challenged. Why the change? Not for beauty, the cups didn't match. Not for necessity, the original cup was intact. The gesture had meaning. It introduced an anomaly into ritual, and rituals, once altered, always left marks. In the days that followed, nothing was said aloud. No accusations were voiced. No glances lingered long enough to accuse, and yet the atmosphere inside Langley Court had turned. Mrs. Markham moved as she always had, gently, dutifully, silent in her attentiveness, but the silence now felt heavy, not light. Gerald's tone toward her became colder, not cruel, but pointedly formal. Claire's amusement, once casual, now carried a note of calculation. Even the staff, once deferent, now hesitated slightly in their responses to her, not because of what had been said, but because of what had not. Battle watched this shift without interfering. He did not ask again about the teacup. He did not summon Mrs. Markham for further questioning. Instead, he allowed the tension to thicken, to coil naturally through the corridors. In doing so, he knew, truth, or something near to it, might rise on its own. In rooms governed by quiet, pressure never burst. It seeped. in softened exchanges, in the stiffness of backs turned just too quickly, in the over-polished saucers returned to the sideboard. Suspicion moved without name, and Battle, who had spent his life listening to silence more than speech, let the silence speak. There would be no outburst, no confession, but something had already cracked, and within that crack, the shape of guilt might one day be seen clearly. They walked without purpose through the garden's outer edge, past the thinning laurels and towards the moss-lined path that curled behind the orchard wall. Sanjay Vane kept his hands behind his back, the posture of a man both guarded and well taught. The wind stirred the hem of his coat, but not his expression. Superintendent Battle, slightly behind, did not press the silence. He had found, long ago, that words forced into a space too soon lost their weight. Sanjay spoke at last, not abruptly, but with a tone that suggested the words had been measuring themselves for some time. He never signed the dismissal, he said. That was the point. It was a private arrangement. A quiet ruin. Battle inclined his head slightly, waiting. My father, Ashok Dutt, was a clerk at the High Court. He made the mistake of being correct in front of someone powerful. That's all it ever took. His voice remained level, but there was a tension in the way he drew breath. Judge Vane found fault where there was none. Documents misplaced, questions asked, allegiances realigned, and suddenly a name was blackened, not erased, but stained enough to be refused by everyone else. He paused beside the sundial, touching its rim absently with one finger. We left for Bombay with what we could carry. He taught in the north after that, died before his 51st birthday. But he never stopped teaching me that truth was a weapon you must sheath, unless you're prepared to lose with it. Battle listened, saying nothing. The sun, pale behind the clouds, threw no shadow. She wrote to me, Sanjay said. Lower now, Lady Marcia. Weeks ago, she said, she had read something of his. That she had found records, quietly kept, in a drawer she never opened. She didn't apologize, but she told me she believed he had been wronged. Battle nodded once. The words mattered, but so did the manner in which they were spoken, not with bitterness, not with triumph, but with an inherited weariness passed from father to son. She asked me to come, Sanjay said. So I did. The next words came after a long pause. I spoke to her, he said, privately. She let me say what I had to. Battle turned slightly, enough to glance at the man beside him. And did you? He asked, softly. Sanjay gave a small nod. I told her the truth, but I didn't demand anything. I didn't come for that. She was ill, Battle said. Yes, Sanjay replied. And tired, but she listened. They stood a moment longer, the trees still in their solemn line behind them. I didn't kill her, Sanjay said simply. That's not what I came for. Battle believed him, not because of the denial, but because of the way he had said everything else. The west parlor was lit now with weak winter sun, and the windows, long since sealed for draughts, bore the faint bloom of condensation along their edges. Claire stood by the mantel, a cigarette unlit in one hand, though the ashtray nearby bore signs of several predecessors. When Battle entered, she glanced at him once, then turned back to the empty grate. He asked her about the letter. She did not pretend to misunderstand. Yes, she said. I found it, pinned beneath the lining of that ridiculous desk she never let anyone touch. Her tone was not angry, merely tired, as if the act of honesty had exhausted its usefulness. I read it twice, and then I asked her what she meant by it. Battle remained still, hands lightly clasped behind his back. She didn't deny it, Claire went on. only looked at me as if I'd finally joined her in some quiet abyss she'd occupied for decades. You told her the truth, Battle said. Claire gave a short breath, not quite a laugh. I told her that I had never admired him, not as they had, that the man she married ruined people, and never blinked, and that I wondered how long she had known. There was a silence. She didn't argue. I think she knew she had waited too long to say anything. Battle inclined his head, and then she asked for tea, Claire said, and I went upstairs. He said nothing. She turned to face him fully. She was already dying, Superintendent. I only told her what the house had never allowed anyone to say. The drawing room had not altered. The chair remained in its familiar place beside the hearth, the cushions dented slightly from recent use. Battle stood near the mantel, his gaze not on the furnishings, but on the ornamental French clock that sat centered and proud. The time, he noted, was precisely correct. That in itself was unremarkable. The house functioned by schedule. It would have been out of character for a timepiece to be allowed any slack. But there was something too perfect in the alignment. The small brass key, usually tucked behind the clock's base, now lay slightly askew as if replaced in haste. He reached for it, lifted it once, and returned it carefully. The minute hand clicked as it settled back, rewound, but not by the maid. She had not dusted the mantel since the morning of Lady Marcia's death. That much she had confirmed. Someone else had touched the clock. He examined it with slow precision, not for fingerprints, not for smudges. Those would come later if needed. It was the act itself that mattered. Clocks did not require rewinding every day, and certainly not in a house already observing mourning. The decision to touch it, to adjust it, had not been accidental. It was a statement, quiet, almost ceremonial, an insistence on control, of time, of sequence, of memory. The fire had not been relit. The ashtray remained clean, but the clock, that most overlooked of ornaments, had been wound. Battle stepped back, allowing the weight of that act to settle in the room like dust, undisturbed. He stood there for some time. Stillness in certain places spoke louder than sound. The clock, ticking softly now, filled the silence with its slow, deliberate rhythm, a sound that carried meaning only when one knew to listen. It was not simply that someone had touched it. It was the certainty that someone had needed to, in that room, beneath the oil portrait and the dim-lit sconces. Battle considered not just the mechanics of crime, but the choreography of grief. Someone had stood where he stood, had reached forward with quiet intent, had wound the clock, not because it was necessary, but because something in the world, briefly and desperately, needed to be made right. The act was not one of deception, it was ritual, the restoration of order. And in that act, Battle saw not guilt, but fear, not calculation, but loss. Every house held secrets, but only the oldest ones, the ones thick with memory and hierarchy, buried them under the ticking of clocks and the pouring of tea. Someone, Battle now knew, had tried to reset something that could not be rewound. The drawing room had not been formally altered, though some subtle reordering had taken place. The cushions had been replaced and the hearth swept, yet the faint scent of bergamot still lingered, a memory of the tea served on the last afternoon of Lady Marcia's life. The windows, drawn back against a pale noon, admitted just enough light to reduce the need for lamps, and the grandfather clock in the corner ticked with the polite certainty that time, at least, could still be trusted to move in its proper order. Superintendent Battle stood beside the writing table, hands folded behind his back. He had not raised his voice, nor rung a bell, nor sent for anyone formally, and yet, One by one they came. Gerald entered first, as if by right, his expression unreadable, chin tilted fractionally higher than necessary. Claire followed, cool and composed, her gaze flicking only once across the gathering before settling on an empty chair. Sanjay came after, without hesitation, though his presence still bore the quiet dignity of an outsider. Mrs. Markham stood just inside the threshold, pausing until Battle nodded for her to enter. She moved with care, as though afraid of breaking something already cracked. Mr. Merton, pale and silent, took a place near the bookcase, where he had often stood during less memorable family conversations. The atmosphere was not confrontational, it was ceremonial, the kind of assembly where truths, if they appeared at all, were expected to bow to civility. Battle waited until all were seated, then he looked once toward the empty chair near the fire, the place Lady Marcia had so often occupied, and began to speak, not with drama, nor with accusation, but with the calm authority of a man who had studied still water long enough to know where the currents lay. He spoke as though explaining a household matter, something practical and requiring resolution. There was no flourish, no rehearsed indignation, only a precise unfolding of facts, assembled not for spectacle, but for understanding. "We begin," he said quietly, "with a cup of tea." The tray had been brought in as it had always been. The teapot had been filled with the usual blend. The cups had appeared familiar, or close enough that no comment was made. And yet, Battle said, one thing had changed. Not enough to warrant alarm, but enough to matter. The cup Lady Marcia used that afternoon did not belong to her service. It came from a set kept in the companion's room, a different porcelain, subtly shaped, of a slightly older make. It had been brought at Mrs. Markham's request, owing to what she had described as a chip in the regular cup. No such chip was found. The tea, Battle continued, had been poured and served as usual. The family had dispersed. Lady Marcia had remained seated in her chair by the hearth. When she was next seen, she was dead. What followed, Battle said, was a question of details. Not loud ones, but those that remained after silence had been imposed. The placement of the teacup, the absence of a fingerprint where one ought to have been, the single set of prints that did remain, on the rim of the substituted saucer, belonging not to the maid who had carried the tray, but to Mrs. Markham. He did not look at her when he said it, nor did she move. He allowed the silence to stretch a moment before continuing. Lady Marcia, he said, was not a woman given to whims. Her rituals were unchanging, her precision in social matters second nature. It was unlikely, improbable, that she would accept a different cup, particularly one from another's private set, unless it had been offered with quiet insistence. Nor was she the sort of woman to drink from a cup, chipped or unsatisfactory. She would have refused it altogether. And yet, on that day, she drank. Battle paused, only long enough to draw breath, and then resumed. The presence of digitalis in her system was conclusive. It had not been taken over time, but recently, in a single dose. It had been added to the tea, or the cup, deliberately. There was no suggestion of mistake, and yet, he said, there was no sign of conflict, no hurried action, no violence. The cup had been accepted, the tea poured, the seat, when she was found, undisturbed. What then could be concluded? That the tea was meant for someone, but not for her. He did not say the name, he let the words sit between them, their implication as clear as it was unspoken. She had drunk it, Battle said, knowing what it contained, and in that simple act, something else had been revealed, not a crime of violence, but of grief. Not the taking of life, but the quiet refusal to allow another to lose theirs. A final decision, unspoken, untraceable, but exact. Lady Marcia had chosen not to prevent the act, she had chosen to complete it, and in doing so, to alter the ending. He paused only once before speaking again, as if granting the room permission to breathe. No one did. Mrs. Markham's hands remained neatly folded in her lap, her expression a mask of composure so tightly drawn that it had begun to resemble something else entirely, something more brittle than brave. Superintendent Battle's voice, when it resumed, was quiet, almost reflective. "There is," he said, "a difference between guilt and grief. The former seeks to hide, the latter often volunteers itself too early, too often, and in the wrong direction." His gaze remained fixed, not on any one person, but somewhere in the space between them, neutral ground in a battlefield of inheritance, resentment, and silence. "The evidence suggests," he continued, "that the cup was prepared with knowledge, not cunningly, not elaborately, not even expertly, just carefully, enough to place something into the tea that would not be noticed, something bitter, but not instantly so. The word digitalis was not spoken again. It didn't need to be. And yet," he said slowly, "the presence of fingerprints told us something the poison did not. The cup had been handled only by one person after it was placed, and before it was drunk. There were no others. Still no one moved. That person," Battle said, "was Mrs. Markham." The reaction was not shock, but silence, the silence of people who had already suspected, and had simply not known how to voice it. Gerald's fingers, resting on the armrest, flexed slightly. Claire looked away, not in disbelief, but in a gesture of withdrawal. Merton's posture stiffened, not with moral outrage, but with the dawning horror of procedural entanglement. "I do not believe," Battle said, now turning toward her, "that she intended harm to anyone else." She looked at him then, not in protest, but with something closer to understanding. "You were meant to drink the tea, weren't you, Mrs. Markham?" Her lips parted, though no sound came. Her head dropped, faintly. "It is not uncommon," he said gently, "for guilt to present itself as duty, particularly when it has gone long unspoken. You believed yourself implicated, not in the past, but in the present. You had learned something that to your mind required redress." A single tear rolled, unannounced, down her cheek. "You prepared the tea, you chose the cup, you meant it to be taken alone." He did not accuse, he merely recited, and in his recitation, something in the room settled, not with peace, but with clarity. "It was meant," he finished, "for yourself." A stillness followed, greater than before, the kind that exists only in the space after truth, but before consequence. But Battle had not finished. He spoke again, more slowly now, each word carrying its own careful measure. "Lady Marcia," he said, "knew." Another silence, but this one held a different weight, the weight of comprehension. She had already read the letter. She had, I believe, already decided to tell Sanjay the truth. She had already made changes to her will, and she had already understood what that would mean for you. He turned his gaze once more toward the hearth, where the empty chair remained precisely where it had been. "She did not stop you from making the tea. She did not warn you, but she watched." He allowed the sentence to settle. "And when the time came, she took your place." It was said without drama, no raised voice, no trembling emphasis, and yet the room contracted around the words, as if drawing itself tighter. "She drank from the cup you prepared, not out of ignorance, but out of choice." He stepped forward now, but only by a pace. She had known silence all her life. She had lived under its laws, but in those final hours, she acted, not to erase what had happened, but to absorb it. She drank the thing you could not. She protected you from scandal, from law, from the weight you had given yourself to carry. Mrs. Markham sat motionless, but her breath had changed. Shorter now, but steadier, as if something constricting had loosened, just slightly, from around her chest. Battle's tone softened further, though it did not waver. She saw that you intended no harm to others, that you had in your own way sought to punish only yourself. He looked around the room. "It is not a defense in law," he said quietly, "but it is a kind of justice." No one spoke. The drawing-room held the silence with dignity. It was no longer the silence of fear or concealment, but of something harder to name. Outside, the sound of the wind moving through the dry hedge barely registered, but Battle heard it, and knew that Langley Court had begun, in its own slow fashion, to breathe again. For a moment after the final words were spoken, Mrs. Markham remained composed, hands folded in her lap, head bowed, the fragile architecture of control intact. But it was not built to last. Battle watched it crack, not violently, but with the soft, inevitable disintegration of a structure too long held under strain. A tremor passed through her shoulders, not the kind that invited pity, nor the kind that demanded comfort, but a ripple born of something ancient, the yielding of a conscience long kept in darkness. Her lips moved once, then again, as though practicing the shape of honesty before allowing its sound. "I didn't want," she began, and stopped. The room listened. No one interrupted. "I didn't want it to end like this," she said. Her voice was small, not childlike, but pared down by grief to something elemental. "I meant only to bear it quietly. I thought that would be enough." It was not clear to whom she addressed the words, to Battle, to Lady Marcia's absent presence, or to herself. Perhaps all three. "She told me," Mrs. Markham continued, her gaze now unfixed, "what he had done. The letter, the ruin of a man who had done no wrong. I didn't know. I had thought him stern, never cruel, but she said it had broken someone, and that she had kept the silence." Her hands trembled now, not from fear, but from something deeper, a relinquishment. "I couldn't bear that silence any more. I thought if I removed myself, it would be tidy, a correction, that no one else would suffer, but she saw through me, as she always did." There was no sobbing, only the soft cadence of speech that had long been denied the dignity of air. A breath drawn, another sentence offered. "She chose to carry what I couldn't." Gerald made a motion as if to rise, then stopped. Claire had turned toward the window, though her jaw had set, as though grinding down a rising wave of emotion into something manageable. Merton looked away, not in disapproval, but with the quiet shame of a man who had once chosen ignorance out of convenience. Battle said nothing. His silence was not indifferent. It was the silence of authority used not to suppress but to contain, to shape space around grief, not intrude upon it, and in that silence, Mrs. Markham wept, not dramatically, not excessively, but with the honest tears of a woman who had finally ceased the labor of concealment. They fell, soft and soundless, onto the fabric of her dress, and no one moved to stop them. When the room had emptied and the great door to the drawing-room stood half open in quiet invitation to depart, Battle remained. He had spoken to the local constable, a man earnest enough to want action, but sensible enough to take instruction. There would be no charges laid, no statement filed, no coroner's inquest beyond the most formal observations. The death certificate would read what it must. The truth, complicated, layered and indivisible from conscience, would remain unrecorded in official annals. Justice, in this instance, had not needed to wear its usual garb. Battle stepped into the front hall, where the shadows had lengthened but not yet consumed the last traces of afternoon. Footsteps retreated down carpeted corridors. A door clicked softly shut upstairs. In the stillness, he considered what had passed and what remained. Lady Marcia Varn had taken with her more than guilt. She had removed the possibility of scandal, of courtroom revelation, of the slow public stripping of a family's grief. She had, in her last act, arrested the forward motion of destruction, not by denying truth, but by containing it within herself. There were no medals awarded for such deeds, no lines in official reports. But Battle, who had seen the worst of ambition and cowardice alike, understood the difference between punishment and peace. And he knew that Langley Court, for all its stillness, would carry the echo of that choice long after legal interest had faded. As he reached for his hat, not hastily, but with the same care he applied to every small ritual, the butler appeared silently at the edge of the stairwell. Their eyes met, no words passed between them. None were needed. Some houses required sentences, others only silence. Langley, it seemed, had finally earned the latter, and so, beneath the faded tapestries and between the chimes of the old clock, justice took the quietest form it knows, that of understanding. But tell me, was Lady Marcia's final choice one of selfless love, or a reckoning only she had the right to deliver? What do you believe truly happened at Langley Court? Share your thoughts or theories in the comments below. I'd be most curious to read them. If you enjoyed this story, gently pass it along, like it, share it with those who appreciate a quiet mystery, and subscribe for more tales wrapped in silence and secrets.